Hello, and welcome to Day 3 of United Facts of America, a festival brought to you by PolitiFact and the Poynter Institute. I'm Alex Mahadevan, Director of MediaWise, Poynter's Digital Media Literacy Initiative, and I am here in the PolitiFact office, but their fact checkers and editors are hard at work preparing for tonight's big debate. Don't forget, you can tune back in here at 7 p.m. for a behind-the-scenes look at how they get ready. I actually might sneak back in to get some of that famous debate night pizza. For the first time, thanks to support from people like you, United Facts of America is free to all guests, but you can still support truth in politics with PolitiFact. Join us in the pursuit of truth. Your contribution, big or small, directly impacts the integrity of public discourse. Stand with PolitiFact to safeguard the integrity of our democracy. Donate today and be part of the solution. Visit politifact.com/donate to make a difference now. And now, that support is more important than ever. I've been following the intersection of misinformation and artificial intelligence for a while now. You may have heard the buzz around ChatGPT or deepfakes, and I have two great guests to discuss the topic through the lens of the Israel-Hamas war and help us make sense of this new reality that we are living in. I'm joined by Felix Simon, communication researcher and doctoral student at the Oxford Internet Institute, where he spent the last 4 years researching the effects of artificial intelligence in journalism and the news industry. Felix is a Knight News Innovation Fellow and an affiliate at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He also works as a research assistant at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. Felix has penned some of my favorite recent research on how newsrooms are harnessing AI and their guidelines for doing so, and whether or not AI is actually overblown. We'll get to that. And Hari Sreenivasan, anchor of PBS NewsHour Weekend, an Amanpour and Company contributor, the senior correspondent for PBS NewsHour, and a renowned MediaWise ambassador, one of our first, who helps get media literacy resources into the hands of every American. Hari was with us at Global Fact in Seoul this year, where he proved a dogged seeker of truth. One of my favorite professional accomplishments was appearing on Hari's series, Take on Fake, a show on YouTube in which he debunks misinformation and shows viewers how to do it themselves. Your questions drive the conversation here at United Facts of America. Don't hold back. Ask about anything on your mind, because your curiosity sparks valuable insights. If you're watching us now on PolitiFact or Poynter.org, you can open the video on YouTube and leave your questions in the chat. We look forward to answering them during this segment. Thank you both for being here with me. I want to start by setting the stage real quick, if we could. So before we jump into AI, I'll start with you, Hari. In your reporting and watching of social media as the Israel-Hamas war continues, what's the scale of misinformation you've been seeing? What are you seeing? How does it compare to recent conflicts or other misinformation moments we've been seeing?
Thanks, Alex. War is one of those great opportunities for misinformation and disinformation to spread. And we see this happening in all kinds of different conflicts because there are literally people who have a vested interest in trying to push a specific point of view. They want their side to win, hearts and minds. But this, in the last couple of weeks, the scale of misinformation or disinformation has just really been unparalleled in my time. And I sometimes wonder, is it just the flow? There's just so much more of it? But really, it's gotten to a point where I'm, not quite ashamed to say, but I do feel weird saying that I am actively trying not to consume video about the war on social media. And I say that knowing that there are some of my former colleagues at ABC and CBS and other places around the world who are trying to do the best that they can. But given how many little instances where one piece of video is sort of unverified or the source of what is actually happening in that video is one side of the conflict, and how that representation really impacts what you think of what's happening. I mean, I've just gotten to a point where I'm like, you know what? I can wait 2 more days to figure out what happened about this. I'll get my updates in text form. I can read an article, etc. And let's not do the one thing that so much of social media is very good at, which is to inflame people and to really get them amped up and wanting to share information. And so it's like I've actually tried to take a step back in how I consume information about this conflict because of the amount of misinformation that exists, how fast and furious so much of the stuff is going. And I don't know if that's the way that I'm going to be in the future, but certainly I don't plan on changing this for the next few weeks.
That is very profound. I have that feeling too. But coming from a journalist who has to actually take a step back, I think more journalists can probably learn from that. I think a big source of misinformation is being very quick to share things and being first. How about you, Felix? How are you consuming the news as the conflict continues?
In many ways, quite similar to Hari and you, I would say. I mean, I use social media. I'm quite sort of an active user of Twitter/X. I use LinkedIn. I use Facebook. I read various news sources. And in many ways, I mean, I think the one thing we all share on this call is basically we are very prolific consumers of news, and therefore we're not the average. Like lots of people out there actually don't have that strong interest in news as we do, and we've researched and surveys to show that. So I think I'd be a bit careful about our own experience and what we see in terms of mis and disinformation, information generally on this conflict and other conflicts in the past, and what other people are saying. I think that's one thing that always should be sort of at the back of our minds. But personally, for me, I sort of share what Hari said. I mean, it is a lot. But I find it quite hard to say if it's more or less than in previous conflicts. For instance, during the Ukraine, like the height of Russia's attack on Ukraine, I've got lots of friends from Ukraine and a couple of friends from Russia, and it felt somewhat similar in terms of people constantly sharing stuff and providing the latest updates in sort of the early stages of the invasion. And ultimately, it's an empirical question, right? And I don't have a good answer to that. It's really hard to objectively say, is it more, is it less in comparison to these other wins? But it definitely feels like it is a lot. And the best thing, and I'm very glad that Hari said this already, that you can do is take a step back. And we've known this from research and from journalistic practice for years. It's prudent to sort of remove yourself a bit as a reporter, as a consumer of information, and wait, because finding the truth, gathering facts, gathering evidence, that takes time. And in breaking news situations, or in situations where you've sort of very polarized views on the topic, on the subject matter, it's quite easy to accidentally consume information that's not verified, or that's probably false and misleading. And that applies just as much to the Israel-Hamas war as it does to the Ukraine situation, or as it did during COVID.
Yeah, exactly. So in my experience, when October 7th happened, the first thing I did is I was on the road, I was driving, and I opened my laptop, and one of the first things that I saw, literally one of the first things I saw, was footage from a video game called Arma 3 that was being shown as rockets coming from Gaza. One of the very first things that I saw. So I knew we were in for a difficult time. Now, that's easy to debunk. You could just do a reverse image search. You may have seen something like that before, but this conflict in particular, I think what we've seen as it's moved on is it's getting harder to verify claims, because a lot of them are coming from a very dangerous place for journalists to work. There is a massive amount of propaganda that is being injected into the discourse from both sides. So you just see this, this misinformation that's getting harder and harder to verify. And then I don't want to be alarmist or anything, but you throw AI into the fray of things, and it starts to seem pretty hopeless to me and to some people I've talked to. But I'd be curious, Felix, as someone who's been studying this field for a while now, and we've talked previously. I'm starting to see some examples enter the fray, and I'd be curious, what is your experience with seeing AI coming out of this conflict?
I don't want to be like the optimist in this case. I'm trying to be sort of the realist. Personally, my anecdotal evidence is I've seen more misinformation that was mostly old footage, footage from computer games, footage that was recontextualized, rather than sort of actual examples of AI. And the ones I've seen were either fairly easy to debunk or not very convincing. Again, it's hard to say how much of that stuff is out there. But on the verification of that, I mean, in many ways, you and Harry are sort of better people to talk about this than I am. But I sort of wonder if it changes all that much, because in many ways, you should treat any piece of information, especially if it's viral pieces of information, in the same way. You try and find out, is there sort of another view on this? Do we have other sources, other camera angles maybe to verify this? And then ultimately, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if that piece of content was AI generated or not. If you cannot verify it through existing journalistic processes, which have existed before AI sort of arrived on the scene, then you probably shouldn't publish it, or should publish it with a lot of disclaimers and a lot of context. And that's has been good journalistic practice in the times where we only had sort of user-generated content, quote unquote, without the use of AI. And it should be just as true in the days where, yes, people have access to things like Dolly or Midjourney or ChatGPT.
So taking a step back, actually, for those folks who are tuned in who may have not necessarily know what AI, generative AI specifically, that we're talking about, in a few sentences, can you summarize when we're talking about generative AI? Felix, sorry, I saw you're about to take a sip of your water. I promise we're going to break right after this.
So basically, generative AI, I think it's the umbrella term we have these days for the latest advancement in a subfield of artificial intelligence, which is transformer models, also called large language models, where they apply to language. And basically, what that means in some very abstract terms is they are trained on a lot of data, basically like everything that's out there on the internet, if you will. And what these systems are able to do is generate new data. That's in the broadest sense. And that new data could be, for instance, text. It could be videos, it could be audio, it could be images. And the sort of interesting thing there is that this new data that they are able to create based on prompts, based on instructions we give these systems through natural language interface, like a chatbot, can be very realistic. So in case of text, it can be so realistic that you can't reasonably distinguish it from something that was written by you or me or by Hari. And in some ways, that's the same for images. And of course, there are computational techniques to try and understand if something was generated by a computer. And depending on the task, these techniques are actually quite good. But that's broadly what generative AI does. That's where the generative comes from. You basically create something not from scratch, but from pre-existing data that matches in terms of realism what we already have.
Yeah, and you know, I try not to get caught up in hype cycles around new technology. The cynic in me, I did at the very, you know, when ChatGPT had its moment at the beginning of the year, I did an experiment and I created a pink slime news site, a fake news site, completely in like 30 minutes that had headshots of fake writers and bylines and fake news stories. I mean, they were all really bad, but could have probably fooled a lot of people on social media. I'd be curious, Hari, you know, your take on this. You've worked in the news for a while. I think in the news, we've seen all of these moments happen. You know, for me personally, it was the pivot to video when an editor gave me a camera and said, we need to make 5 Facebook videos a day. If you want your paycheck, go do that. So we've seen these kind of moments where we are witnessing this kind of change in the information ecosystem. This is a broad question. I'm asking a lot of you, Hari, but what is your take on generative AI and its effect on misinformation? And if you could, maybe the lens of a conflict like the war we're seeing.
So I think that, as Felix mentioned, that there have always been steps to verify what a fact is. I think we are now going to have to add more tools to a journalist's sort of kit to figure out a little bit more forensically, reverse image search, or using some sort of other tools to figure out where was there a watermark left behind by a generative AI tool that can be spotted, right? I mean, if people take 3, 5, 15 steps to try to obfuscate this, obviously it's going to be harder. But I think that the tools that existed and always will exist are pressured by our own time constraints. For example, why does the 5 o'clock news have to be at 5 o'clock, right? And what is the fact that you need to get on the air by that moment? And sometimes that's when a lot of these errors occur. If the reporter or the producer, I'm thinking in broadcast terms, had the time to just say, hey, we cannot pin this down. We cannot go to air with this. Please don't put this on TV yet. We might be late. The TV station across the street might put it on, just so you know. I hope you don't mind that, but we're going to know definitively whether this is or this isn't by 6:30, and that's past our program, right? So like there's those kinds of time crunches and those kind of pressures that we put into the fact-checking process that makes it more error prone. I think generative AI specifically, it is going to take a little bit more. Like, for example, last week, a week and a half ago, my voice is still recovering, but I completely had laryngitis. I was out on a shoot, all kinds of a head cold, everything else. Like, it couldn't be worse for somebody who has to project their voice on TV. And last night, the story aired, and you could tell, like, what's wrong with his voice, right? Is one of the comments that keep coming up. Well, I also was supposed to like record something for publication later that day, and I was like, I got nothing. I got no voice. So, I asked the person, said, well, how tech savvy is your editor? No, pretty decent. And so I had a conversation with this editor, and I said, the video editor, and I said, have you ever used a tool by 11 Labs? And he's like, yeah, okay. And so I gave the producer kind of a one-time written contractual exception to do this, but there is a video currently on the internet and that has been broadcast on television, not for the news hour, but that has my voice where I never said those words at all, right? Generative AI is, to me, here. It's not sort of some theoretical abstraction. It helped me do my job, and that was a better use case of it. But what really freaked me out was when I showed this to a member of my family, and I said, hey, can you watch this video? And the person just said, well, what do you want me to see? Yeah, this is just you doing a TV story. And I said, no, that's not me. That's not my voice. Really kind of freaked us all out for a second, how good it already is today, right? So I look at generative AI, whether it's in the context of a war or you saw, for example, Clarissa Ward, and she had this sort of dramatic moment on CNN where she was kind of laying down on her side, and, there's some artillery shells or stuff bombs that are kind of going off nearby. And within, I don't know, a couple of hours, audio had already been manipulated to have her say something else. There's actually multiple examples of anchors on television being sort of force-fed things to come out of their mouths, which are not at all what they said. So I kind of look at the sort of larger picture and I say, well, what does this do to people's confidence or trust in what they see? And do they throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? Do they just say, I can't trust any of this stuff. I don't care what CNN says. I don't care what the BBC says. It's all fake. I don't want that. I don't want them to have a complete mistrust of the institution that is news, right? So I'm concerned about these kinds of different tensions that are pulling at people because, look, you think about it, like, I don't know, our reptilian brain has been trained for a few thousand years probably to say that seeing is believing, right? That was one of the last and most incredible verifiers of what reality is. And in an incredibly short amount of time, we are inserting this cognitive dissonance into people's brains that says, maybe it's not real what you're actually seeing. And that's a big adjustment for all of us to collectively make in the period of 2 years or 5 years.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of really good points there. And 11 Labs is, again, another Gen AI software where you can put in as few as 6 seconds of you talking, and it will spit out, a slightly recognizable voice. I sent a voicemail, I left a voicemail for my mom asking for money, saying that I was arrested. That was based on like 6 seconds. And it gave me a Midwestern accent for some reason, but she did say, it was like, if you're panicked, it could be believable. So you kind of bring out the positive and negative of what this technology can do. You bring up the concept of the liar's dividend, which is the idea that a politician could come out and say, well, listen, I didn't say X, Y, or Z. That's actually a deepfake audio. And so I'd be curious, Felix, you wrote, you co-authored some great commentary about these subjects, and you've been thinking about whether or not these worries about AI are potentially overblown. Can you talk a little bit about whether it's the liar's dividend worry, or the worry about the scale of misinformation that AI allows us to do? Like, what are your thoughts? Is AI overblown?
There's such a lot of things I could comment on. I'm trying and pick some of the things Hari has mentioned, just to pick up on them. And in many ways, I mean, one thing that does keep me up as well is this sort of general skepticism and distrust. And that's actually one thing. I mean, despite the piece I co-authored where we said that these fears that we currently have around Gen AI are somewhat overblown. I mean, the piece itself is a bit more nuanced than the title. And actually, we do believe that in the short term, general skepticism towards all kinds of content will go up. I mean, this is a reasonable expectation. And I think generative AI will lead to more of that. But at the same time, you sort of have to see that in historical perspective. And the same fears we sort of currently see around Gen AI, they have also been voiced regarding photography in the sort of early 1900s, late 1800s. Where actually photography, we never could quite sort of believe what we were seeing as soon as photography was invented, because even back then it was fairly easy to manipulate photographs, and it was done at quite a big scale. I mean, quite some funny historical examples of sort of people manipulating images. The most famous one probably being Stalin editing out one of his sort of comrades out of a propaganda picture. And in many ways, we have developed both institutions and social norms that make photography these days sort of broadly trustworthy. Take false text. I mean, that's something that's extremely easy to do, yet still people believe in text they read in most cases, or at least they sort of take it on, and then they sort of cross-compare it with other things they've seen, have read, and sort of cross-check it against their internal database of information, and maybe do some more Googling or some research if they find it suspicious. And I would expect that, broadly speaking, this will be the same for generative AI, and regardless if it's text or video or audiovisual content, broadly speaking. So I think that's one point. On the lies dividend, again, it's quite fascinating to see how this can be used, and it's really interesting. And sort of the example you brought up, Hari, about this tool or set of tools allowing you to do your job, and that's actually what we see in lots of news organizations, and especially those who use AI responsibly, is looking at this set of technologies as something that allows journalists to do their job in a better way, in a more efficient way, in a more effective way, in a more targeted way. So in many ways, that speaks to the way AI can be used for good as a set of technologies, but of course it can also be abused. And that's certainly going to lead to issues around scams, around sort of false adverts, etc. But here too, I think we have to sort of see it in a slightly more nuanced way. And let's take audio, so for example. Yes, it's certainly possible to clone my voice, to clone your voices, and then scam my grandma out of a lot of money. The thing is, this was already possible, and you didn't need actually very sophisticated AI technology to do that. I actually know that from a friend of mine, happened to a grandma, and that was I think 1 or 2 years ago. She got a call. It was definitely not AI generated. It was just someone pretending to be her grandson wanting money. And this woman actually, in that case, went to the bank and was about to take the money out of the account, and thankfully the bank stopped, and it was like, actually, this sounds a bit suspect. So again, that was possible before. And in many ways, it depends on like that this works, and that this works for politicians depends less on technology itself, but on the trust we put in the individual attempting to scam someone or fake something or discredit evidence. So basically, if you have a lot of pre-existing trust, for instance, for partisan reasons in someone like ex-President Donald Trump, then you are more willing to believe him if he says, oh, this recording of mine, that's AI generated. He, in fact, actually did that with the Access Hollywood tape. When that came out, I'm not sure exactly how long after it was, but it was definitely before generative AI sort of arrived on the scene. And he said, I never said this. This is sort of fakery. And I think sort of these two little stories, the grandma story and the Donald Trump story, I think that in some ways shows that technology, yes, it can do these things, it can enable them, it can probably make them worse, but it's not the only factor at play. And we have, historically speaking, developed institutions, social norms around this, which allow us to sort of go through the world and live our lives and not be constantly fooled. Will we get it wrong occasionally? That's true. That's totally the case. And it's unfortunate if it happens, but I think the assumption that it will sort of lead to this massive doom scenario where everything sort of goes down the gutter, I think that's a bit overblown for now.
That is, sorry, go ahead, Hari.
I was going to say the grandma scams, the Federal Trade Commission, I want to say maybe a month ago or so, put out a bulletin that said last year seniors were scammed out of $1.6 billion from a lot of, and this sort of call that you guys are talking about is actually one of the most profitable ways that people make this money. And again, that was pre everyone having access to the equivalent of 11 labs. Right now, whether or not that makes the scammers much more convincing because they actually have a sample clip of you because your social media is littered with lots of samples of your voice, or whether it is, some kid in high school doing whatever, like whatever the nefarious purpose is, are we going to increase the volume of that or just the quality of that, right? And I don't know whether it's both. And yes, Photoshop has been around. Before that, retouching has been around. Now, like, it's all in here. And I wonder whether kind of, should we kind of look at, say, for example, Snapchat filters when they came out and people were starting to like, I don't know what's called, but it was like this like softening of all of the edges. It was like the Barbara Walters lighting. It was very weird. It sort of did something to your face. But it was enough where people were like, why are you doing that to your face? Like that's what you might tell one of your friends, but who knows what the reasons are that people will start to use this stuff and whether that's just kind of integrated into our, own personal pocket technology suite of things that we all have access to now.
Yeah. And you bring up a really good point here. And what I've said, from when I started working at MediaWise in 2019, people were all talking about how deepfakes were going to be a huge factor in the 2020 election, and they were not. And then they're going to be a factor in the 2022 election, and they were not. So in, preparing, when I opened my laptop, when the war broke out, I did have that voice in the back of my head that said, deepfakes and AI are going to be a huge factor in this conflict. And they just have not been. Why is that, Felix, in the context of what we've been chatting about today?
Oh, that's a good question. Ultimately, again, we will have to wait for further research to probe that. But I think in many ways, because it is so easy to create fake news, misinformation, if you will, with other techniques which are quite a lot easier to use. Like take an example, if you wanted to create a piece of misinformation, you would have to generate a prompt, and the prompt then tells Midjourney to create a very convincing image of scene X. And that takes time. It's probably much easier if you just use a bit of footage and then write a false caption or false description around it, and then you post it. In comparison, it is quite the time saving, I'd say. So I would say the sort of the existing approaches of creating misinformation work well enough. Of course, we see it sneaking into the mix, and that's because humans are quite inventive and we like to try things out, and that's just as true for the bad actors as for the good actors. And therefore we will see it and do see it already. But yeah, I think that's sort of my very short answer to it, but maybe Hari has something more interesting to say on that.
No, I think, look, the processing power and the ease of which these tools are going to be in more people's hands leads me to think that there will probably be more instances of it. Now, whether all of them are as convincing, whether all of them, and I also think about this in kind of like these sort of micro community scales. Like, I don't know whether maybe there aren't going to be as many sort of national scale ones, but I also feel like if somebody is sitting at home in a close race in a local election, just spread something across a WhatsApp network of people. Like, we just had in New York, we just had our sort of off-year election for, city council and all kinds of things here. And I would post it on LinkedIn, I'm like, when you want to really be inspired or disturbed by what kind of influence you can have in an election, go look at like your local race and the off-year cycles and see how small the number of people were that actually showed up and did something, and then what the margin might have been of what somebody being elected or not. So that's where it's like on a very micro level, if you just start spreading this to your kids' soccer parents group and you put it to somebody else's carpool thing, it might never bubble up to the level of like, oh my gosh, we need to all investigate this video and it was bad, but it could actually have an impact on a very sort of micro scale. And like right now, if I know that my voice can be regenerated well enough to be on a broadcast of record, I wonder, I'm Joe Biden and I approve this message. That's pretty easy to fake. And so if you can staple that piece of audio onto something that is manipulated, I don't know. I mean, I hope that people are savvy enough to realize it, but I know that, the number of people, I mean, we're kind of relatively speaking elites and early adopters in looking at all of these tech and these tools, right? I mean, there's still half of the audience in America has not read or played with AI tools. I'd say more than that. I think a recent AP poll said 30% of American adults have used maybe an AI chatbot or an image generator, and less than half had, heard or read something about these kinds of tools. So there are going to be more people introduced to it. And again, it's just a tool. You can choose how you want to use this tool for good or for bad. And as the volume of humans that come in contact with the technology and what it can do for them increases, then you're going to have that kind of standard bell curve, right? So what is that? If you go one deviation or two deviations in or out, I should say, what is just the sheer volume of it? So if you say 1 million people have played with AI chatbots and say, okay, on this curve, 5% of those people are going to abuse it. Well, that's still a lot of people if 1 million people have looked at it and used it, right? And so it's just kind of like, how do those edge cases end up redefining kind of the middle? And do they change our perception of a reality in crucial moments? And I think of like the night before the election or the day before, those last persuadable voters, were they intercepted by a piece of information that tipped the scales? And again, that has happened for as long as elections have happened. There might be a last bit of misinformation generated by the opposition. Now it can just be targeted, it can be written, it can be manipulated at a speed at which those previous campaigns couldn't operate.
Yeah. I mean, just briefly on that, I mean, again, ultimately, that's empirical. We will see. I'm not excited, but I'm curious to find out what the answer is to these questions we're sort of playing around with here. I think in some ways, parts of what you said, in many ways, there is already a very strong supply of misinformation in places like the United States, the same in Russia, the same in UK to some degree. So you could almost say there's already a sort of equilibrium in the market that's not necessarily particularly vulnerable to a supply shock, which something like Gen AI could reasonably provide, to sort of use the language of economists. But I think it's also important to remember that the kind of people who consume misinformation mostly are most susceptible to it are not necessarily those who tried and failed to get proper information. Instead, they sort of intentionally reject high quality information and favor misinformation because of low trust in institutions, because of strong partisanship in these things. And that's not necessarily something that's obviously a bad thing. That's something ideally we wouldn't want in sort of a normal polity. So ideally we would, of course, all be sort of rational actors, and we would strive to get the best information, then make our decisions based on it. We all know that this is not how reality works. But at the same time, it also indicates that technology is probably, or AI is probably not changing that underlying situation all that much, because it doesn't come from technology. It comes from social and political cleavages, which are in many cases furthered by politicians and by elites who sort of exploit them to their own political ends. So in many ways, you could say, actually, yes, Gen AI can do all these things, but it's already a very heated and difficult situation and has very little room to sort of operate in.
Mm-hmm. So you bring up a good point throughout that is, in a conflict like we're seeing with the Israel-Hamas war, confirmation bias is incredibly powerful in something like this. And that's the idea that people are going to seek out the information that confirms their existing beliefs, whether it's true, whether it's false, as long as it tells them that their side is correct. And so I'd be curious, Hari, as someone who's been, doing Take on Fake, which is a great show that's really trying to equip people with the tools to navigate the information ecosystem, whether it's teaching them reverse image searching, or I think the one we worked on together was finding out who's behind the information through following someone's digital breadcrumbs. But I'd be curious, what advice do you have on overcoming confirmation bias? What would you tell people, your audience? Because that seems like that's probably the best way to address something like this, but also the hardest way.
It is, because look, in the middle of a war, you literally want to believe that your side is absolutely right, and that there is no way that your side could do something bad, right? I mean, you want to make the other guy look worse in every way possible, because you want moral clarity. You want to be consistent with your kind of internal thinking that says, well, I am absolutely right on this side of the equation, and the other side is absolutely wrong. And so you're given to see any piece of information that confirms that and agree with it. And then, as I see, people from both sides of this conflict share that information. And then when they bump into somebody like me who doesn't sort of retweet it, re-forward it, repost it, and they're like, well, are you with the other side? And I'm like, no, I'm just not reposting anything from a war where I can't verify this information, not even first or secondhand. So, I mean, I think to stave off confirmation bias, I mean, you talk to your priest and your psychologist first, but it's much harder. What you can do in terms of information consumption and re-forwarding, that's something you can do, which is we talked about at the beginning of this, is to take a step back and hold on and figure out whether you're being played, whether you're a pawn in somebody else's chess game, and you are accelerating a piece of information or a video that someone wants to spread farther because they have an agenda, right? And that's something that you can do pretty quickly and just say, well, wait, was this actually from the person who experienced the video or experienced the moment, or has this been filtered and kind of gone through a couple of different layers? And is it now part of an institution? Is it coming from a different brand, et cetera? Those are pretty quick questions that you can answer very fast. Is it like a first degree? Is this actually my cousin who I know firsthand, and they're sending me this video and I trust them like 100%, right? Maybe, but then it kind of goes downhill from there, right? Each additional layer of what might be a modification or a filter, you have to wonder, okay, why is this coming to me this way? And me sharing this now, am I part of this sort of team effort? And then the other thing that I would, try to, and this is a lot more cerebral and almost impossible to do, is I just as a theoretical exercise, I try to say, well, what is the absolute opposite of your belief, and what does this piece of information do to that, right? So I try to kind of, it's not like step into the other person's shoes. I'm not trying to make you a horrible person or anything by doing that. I'm just saying, well, like if you had to challenge your assumption that, say, for example, that my team is absolutely right, that there's no way that they could have done wrong, right? So that's maybe your absolute belief. What is the opposite of that? What if my team is absolutely not the good guys here? What does this little piece of information do to that? Kind of, right? So like, does this challenge it? Does it confirm it? What's going on? So just try to put yourself into, and that's a really hard thing. And I don't think most people are really capable of doing that, because this is so emotional in a war where it's personal to so many people. I have lost this person, or your uncle killed my so-and-so. This is not going to be like something I can fix in a theoretical conversation, or like, oh, well, let's just have, kumbaya moment and everybody can get along. like people are really still in the heat of kind of an inflammation that is very hard to bring this kind of this fever down while there are still kind of rockets and bullets whizzing by.
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult time. So that's kind of the from the micro level, the news consumer. I'd be curious, Felix, before we get to kind of our couple final questions, Felix, I'd be curious, from the news production side, you've obviously talked to a lot of newsrooms, corresponded with newsrooms who are starting to put AI tools to work, so essentially AI for good. How could newsrooms harness AI to address the misinformation that's happening in the Israel-Hamas war right now?
In many ways, that's already happening. So there are existing tools out there which people use to sort of sift through information to detect viral claims. Like for instance, I mean, it probably helps if we go through a couple of examples. So take, for instance, what PolitiFact, which is an independent fact-checking charity in the UK, what they do is basically they've built sort of AI system which allows them to do claim matching. And for them, that's a way to see if a piece of content that has sort of popped up online or on television or in a newspaper has been fact-checked before. Because, of course, not always will the new wording be similar to what has been fact-checked in the past, and therefore allows them then to sort of focus their energies. And if it has been fact-checked before, they will basically send out their existing fact-check on that subject to the matched claim. If it's something new that's sort of gaining traction and salience, then they have new work for themselves. But it basically allows them to sort of get through the cases of misinformation or misleading information out there much quicker in a much more efficient way. That's one way how AI can help. There's also sort of tools and systems in place, also platforms, which is sort of helps with the large scale analysis of particularly popular narratives that might warrant addressing of some sort through fact checking or content moderation. If we talk about platforms, that is broadly speaking AI. I mean, it's not generative AI, but that's machine learning models in many cases. That's already in place. And increasingly, we, of course, also see things like ML models that can help detect AI-generated footage based on very tiny sort of signals, which are imperceptible to the human eye, but for instance, in the case of images are actually detectable by a computer system. So this stuff is out there. It's in some cases, it will be redeveloped or has to be tweaked for generative AI, but that's already happening. And fact checkers around the world, as far as I'm aware, are using these tools. But unfortunately, in some cases, that's not enough. And you will have to do some good old fashioned shoe leather reporting where, yes, you have to try and find a source which was sort of at the locality and can tell you, did a bomb hit or did a bomb not hit at this place? You will have to do the sort of hard and laborious work that journalists have been doing for time immemorial. And that's where I can potentially speed up some things, but it's not going to be the be all end all, unfortunately. But it is there, it's helping. I think that's the broad message.
Mm-hmm. So the big story there is we all will still have jobs. Fact checkers will still fortunately have jobs, just be better at them. We can take more time off, hopefully. Yeah, for those fact checkers watching, don't quote me on that. I'm going to put you both on the spot before we close because I have to bring it up, and we'll try to do kind of a lightning round of answers for this. One answer. So the Biden White House put out an executive order on AI. It is very long and broad. I maybe you checked it out, maybe you didn't, but I think one of the parts of it that interested me the most was how to address mis and disinformation. And what they are going to explore is watermarking for images. Now, I don't know how they're going to put this in place. There are organizations that are working on watermarking or identifying AI generated content. Hari, what should the government do about generative AI?
I don't know if it's a result of what the Biden administration announced, but Meta recently announced that they are going to label political ads that have any generative material in it on both Facebook and Instagram. That's a significant step. I don't know the technology that they're using, whether that they're training it on their own language models, et cetera. I mean, that's a step in the right direction, but I don't think it's going to address anywhere near the kind of totality of what the administration is trying to go after. And even if we got everybody in that room agreed, singing from the same hymnal, and working on figuring out like how are these databases of misinformation, et cetera, there's a massive sort of political pressure in the opposite direction, right? That it's usually confounded with this notion of like free speech, where you see that right now the Stanford Internet Observatory and other places are kind of under the microscope saying, oh, you've been part of like a campaign to censor and suppress thought and ideas and speech in the United States, when I don't think that's the case, and I don't think that's how they were formed and that's what they were doing. So it's a very, regardless of what the administration wants to try to do with generative AI, they're also going to have to deal with the political consequence and a reaction, and looking at all of these steps through a political lens. Because while there might be some bipartisan consensus on, say, not hate, but a real concern about tech companies today, the devil's kind of in the details, right? And so when somebody comes out and does this, somebody's going to say, well, how does that really impact me and my speech? Well, now if you say that my stuff about COVID is misinformation, well, now I have a problem with you and your whatever your model is, et cetera, and I want to shut you down.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Felix? What should the government do?
Full disclosure, I haven't read the executive AI order, so I can't comment on it, but it's a tough one. I agree with Hari on this in many ways. There's only so much you can do on the technical level. I think it's broadly good to push for things like watermarking, for some technical solutions which allow you to label Gen AI content, to track it, to track the provenance of content, sort of broadly speaking, and to encourage / force companies who are developing and releasing those models to consider these issues and actually build in safety mechanisms, and support research and initiatives who try to, for instance, track the spread of generative images, etc. But ultimately, the big problem is a lot of that. We're sort of talking about sort of deep-seated political and social issues, and you can't sort of wave them away with your technological regulation one, so they will persist. And when it comes to mis and disinformation, the biggest problem is still politicians lying to voters, lying to people. It's media organizations who are not in the business of truth, but broadly speaking, the business of spreading misinformation, or at least charged information that sort of supports a certain narrative and has a spin. And that's not something you can address through technological regulation. That's something that ultimately concerns all of us in the political system we want to live in. And especially in a country like the United States, where freedom of speech is sort of put on a very strong pedestal, it's not really clear to me how you can address something like Donald Trump lying and lying and lying again, other politicians doing the same, which will have a much bigger effect on voters and people than the latest Gen AI developments. So I don't know. It's a tough one.
I think the shrug emoji could pretty much be the symbol of a discussion like this. But what I will say is we'll leave it here. This is a topic that you could speculate on for hours. You could project 10 years out and try to figure out what's going on, and we will never know what will happen in the next few weeks. But I think today your perspective really helped myself, our audience, understand the issue a lot better, and maybe start looking ahead at what's next, regardless of what comes. So I really appreciate you both being here. I want to thank everyone who joined us for this great discussion. And a reminder, United Facts of America continues tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Time as we take you behind the scenes as PolitiFact preps for the next GOP presidential debate. See how they get ready, learn what they're looking for, and hear more about their partnership with ABC News and 538. That's 7 p.m. tonight, ahead of the 8 p.m. debate in Miami.